In the quieter quarter of Edinburgh, where the stones remember things people forget, there stood an old wooden bench nestled beside the back wall of St. Giles Cathedral. It faced no view, offered no comfort, and bore no plaque. The city had simply built around it, as if it were too stubborn to leave and too unsightly to honor. The wood had grayed into splinters. Moss had claimed its legs. But still, it stood. On a particular Monday, under a particularly sullen sky, a man sat there. He was elderly, wiry, draped in what could charitably be called a coat, more wool than shape, more memory than cloth. His shoes had holes, his umbrella had a broken spoke, his beard looked like it had survived 2 winters and regretted both. In his lap was a plastic bag, translucent and wrinkled. Inside it, a bruised apple and a paperback novel with no cover. The city walked past. Some quickened their steps. A few glanced, frowned, forgot. Most didn't see him at all. That's how it is with the homeless in old cities. People walk faster where guilt stirs. Except her. Clara Wren wasn't anyone the city wrote about. She was the kind of woman buildings forget as soon as she leaves them. Not pretty in the aggressive way society notices, nor eccentric enough to draw curiosity. She lived above a bakery that opened too early and closed too late. She worked part-time at the university library and full-time avoiding unnecessary conversations. But Clara noticed. She noticed bookmarks left behind in returned novels. She noticed when the birds disappeared from her windowsill 3 days before the rain. She noticed when someone looked hungry, not just unwashed. She noticed the man on the bench. She'd seen him before, twice, maybe 3 times. Always near this spot. Always silent, self-contained. Never begging. That, more than anything, stayed with her. He didn't ask. He endured. This time, she approached. He didn't see her until she was just a few feet away. When he did, his body stiffened slightly, the way a stray animal does when someone gets too close.
"Sir," she said.
"You'll catch your death out here." He looked up. His eyes were startling. Pale blue, almost icy. But not empty. No, they were sharp. Curious. Even amused. "Death's not punctual in this city," he replied, voice dry as parchment. "I've been waiting." Clara smiled faintly, then nodded toward the cafe across the street. "There's soup inside. Leek, I think."
"I'll buy."
The man tilted his head, as though trying to solve a puzzle. "You don't know me."
"No."
"But you look like you could use something warm." He studied her for a few seconds longer, then stood up slowly. "Only if they have bread." "They do," Clara said. "And butter if you ask nicely." They walked in silence across the street. He moved stiffly, as though trying to remember how walking worked. The cafe welcomed them with the smell of old books and roasted tomatoes. It was half full, just enough people to notice them, not enough to intervene. Clara ordered 2 bowls of leek and potato, 2 slices of soda bread, and tea. She paid without drama. He sat across from her at a window seat, his plastic bag on the floor beside his feet like a loyal dog. "Name's Henry," he said at last, between sips of tea. "Clara." He nodded. "Like the Schumann piece." She blinked. "You know classical music?" "I used to teach it, among other things." Over soup, he unfolded his story. Not dramatically, not to impress. Just facts, laid gently on the table like silverware. He had once been Professor Henry McCrae. Taught comparative literature and music theory at the University of Edinburgh. Published papers on everything from Bach's use of silence to the structure of Russian tragic novels. Lectured in halls across Europe. Then his wife died. Cancer, swift and merciless. A year later, his daughter stopped speaking to him. He never learned exactly why. Grief, probably. Or blame. He'd stopped asking. The university pension had lapsed. He'd forgotten to fill out some paperwork. Depression crept in like rot. One day, he walked out of his flat and never quite walked back in. That had been 6 years ago. Clara didn't interrupt, didn't offer sympathy. She just listened. And when the bowls were empty, she said something she hadn't planned. "There's a spare room in my flat. It's small, but it's warm. And it has a desk. You're welcome to it." Henry stared at her, the spoon still in his hand. "You don't even know me," he said again. "I think I do," Clara replied. "You were once someone. That doesn't stop being true just because other people forgot." He looked away, eyes fixed on the window. Rain was starting again, thin needles dancing on the glass. "I snore," he muttered. "I wear earplugs," she countered. He smiled just barely. That night, Henry McCrae moved into the spare room above the bakery. Clara didn't tell anyone. Who would she tell? For the first few days, they lived like awkward roommates. Henry slept most of the time. Clara worked late. They passed in the kitchen like ghosts with better manners. Then things changed. It started with a knock on her door at 7 a.m. She opened it in her bathrobe. Henry stood there, fully dressed, holding a stack of books. "Your library system is chaos," he said. "I'm fixing it." He spent the next 3 days reorganizing her shelves. By author, then by era, then briefly by color, until he decided that was madness and began again. He made breakfast sometimes. Strong coffee, scrambled eggs, toast like cardboard. Clara never complained. She caught him humming Debussy while ironing his shirt one afternoon. He muttered something about muscle memory. But the biggest change came one rainy evening when Clara returned from work and found her kitchen transformed. Papers everywhere. On the table, the counter, even the toaster. Longhand notes, printed articles, diagrams. And in the middle of it all, Henry, chewing the end of a pencil. "I think I've started," he said. "Started what?" "The book I was always too proud to write." By the second week, Clara stopped pretending it was temporary. Henry McCrae had claimed the flat's kitchen table like a general occupying headquarters. He scribbled notes on notepads, serviettes, even a receipt from the corner shop. He muttered to himself in 3 languages, English, French, and a passable Russian. Books formed towers around his chair. Some leaned like drunks. One shelf collapsed entirely. Clara didn't mind. It was the sound of someone coming alive. She had seen brokenness before, both in books and in people. It had its own sound, slow, invisible, quiet like retreating footsteps. But this was not that. Henry was building something. And though she didn't yet know what, she knew enough not to interrupt it. They developed a rhythm. Mornings began with Henry at the stove making what he insisted were eggs in the Parisian style, but which tasted more like overambitious omelets. Clara brewed tea. They didn't speak much before 9 a.m., as a matter of shared civility. Then he wrote, and she read, or shelved, or biked to the library. When she returned, they sometimes talked about politics or Chopin, or the disturbing rise in café prices near the Royal Mile. But more often they sat in silence, comfortable, companionable, unusual. The manuscript emerged slowly. A dozen pages, then 30, then hundreds. Clara caught glimpses. Phrases underlined in red. Chapter titles. The collapse of applause, how grief rewrites grammar. A window without curtains. One page, sitting carelessly on the floor, was headed simply, Clara. She picked it up, read only 2 lines, then put it back without a word. She never asked about it again. One night, Henry knocked on her door. It was late, past midnight. She opened it to find him holding a steaming mug and a trembling hand. "I think I just finished," he said. She stepped aside, wordlessly, and they sat at the table. He showed her the first sentence. It read, "For a long time, I thought silence was safer than speech, until someone spoke to me without needing a reason." Clara closed the folder, nodded once, and stood to put the kettle on. She didn't say congratulations. He didn't expect it. Instead, she said, "You'll need someone to read it. Someone who doesn't already worship your punctuation." Henry gave a dry smile. "I know, just the bastard." He mailed it the next day to his old editor at Carrick & Sons, a man named Walter Greaves. Henry hadn't spoken to him in over a decade. Their last exchange had involved Henry telling him to take his marketing strategy and shove it somewhere unprintable. Walter had responded by sending Henry a Christmas card every year since, out of sheer Scottish spite. 2 weeks later, the response arrived. Handwritten. on thick paper. Walter's handwriting was still like a drunk spider skating on ice. Henry, you bastard. This is your best work. If you had handed this in instead of that tragic nonsense in 2009, we'd both be living in Tuscany. I want to publish it. We'll do a small print run.
Quiet.
Serious. Classy. Like an old whiskey label. No launch parties. No puff pieces. Just words. Also, tell the woman, Clara, is it? That I owe her a bottle of Talisker. She brought you back. And that matters. Henry read the letter aloud to Clara over breakfast. She said nothing at first. Then, what's Talisker? Whiskey, Henry replied. Smoky. Burns like memory. The book was set to be released under the Carrick imprint that spring. What followed was nothing short of a resurrection. Clara watched it unfold the way one watches weather. Helpless, fascinated, slightly damp. Reviewers used phrases like lacerating clarity and graceful fury. The Times literary supplement called it a requiem for dignity. Old students wrote letters. One sent a bottle of wine from Spain with a note that simply read, "Still learning, Professor." Even the university that had quietly replaced Henry with a younger, shinier version of himself extended an invitation. The Henry McCrae Lecture Series, they called it. A kind of apology dressed in poster board. Henry declined the first 3 emails. Clara finally said, maybe go.
Not for them.
For the ones who never forgot you.
He went.
Gave a talk titled The Cost of Disappearing. The hall was full. Some students didn't know his name, only the title of the book. Others remembered. Some wept. One professor stood at the back and didn't stop clapping even after everyone else had sat down. That night, Henry and Clara walked home in silence. The streets glistened from recent rain. The city smelled like wet stone and roasted chestnuts. Clara walked beside him, hands in her coat pockets. She didn't ask how it felt. She didn't need to. Henry stopped near their usual bench, the one he used to haunt like a ghost. I used to sit here, he said, back when I was waiting to vanish. And now, she asked. He looked at her with those pale, unreadable eyes. Now I wonder why no one stopped me sooner. Clara didn't answer. She just sat beside him, the way he once thought no one would. And that, more than the book sales, more than the letters and standing ovations, was when Henry McCrae finally believed he had returned. Not to the world, but to himself. The success of The Invisible Kind crept across Britain like winter mist, slow, quiet, impossible to ignore. It was never viral, never loud. There were no morning talk shows, no PR gimmicks, no influencer reviews. Just bookstores moving copies. Reading groups exchanging underlined pages. Strangers leaving post-it notes in libraries. This saved my week. And with it came attention. Inevitable, inconvenient attention. Agents wanted to option it for film. One American publisher offered a transatlantic tour. A French house proposed a translation deal, which Henry vetoed immediately. The French already know too much about despair, he muttered. But one invitation stuck. It came from the director of the Hay Literary Festival, Britain's most prestigious congregation of literary ego and occasional genius. Henry had been invited once before, 20 years ago, back when he was the darling of the circuit. That year, he'd insulted a Booker Prize winner, gotten drunk before noon, and delivered a keynote on the intellectual poverty of panel discussions. He hadn't been invited since. Until now. Clara found the envelope on the kitchen counter, left unopened. Gold embossed, painfully tasteful. You're not going? She asked. Henry shrugged, dunking a biscuit into his tea. It's a zoo. All stylists know soul. Clara raised an eyebrow. And yet the zoo wants its ghost lion back. That made him laugh, really laugh. She picked up the envelope and slid it into his hand. You don't have to do it for them. But there will be people there who've read your book in the dark and cried. He looked at her a moment. Then slowly he nodded.
Hey on why?
Late spring. Clara went with him, against his initial protest. Someone needs to stop me from quoting Tolstoy mid-interview, he said. They fear Russian literature. They took a train from Waverley Station. First class. courtesy of the publisher. Clara stared out the window most of the way, pretending not to notice the way Henry rubbed his palms against his knees like a nervous schoolboy. He hadn't worn a suit in years. It showed. The sleeves were a little short, the collar too tight. His tie, Clara noted, had once been fashionable during the Thatcher era. They arrived to reign, obviously. The town was flooded with writers, editors, readers, and the people who orbit literature for status. Clara hated it instantly. Henry, to her surprise, was charming. He gave a reading in a tent that smelled faintly of wet hay and expensive coffee. He was introduced as a phoenix in tweed. He winced at that. Then he read. The audience listened in silence. One woman wept openly. An older man in the second row stood after and said, I thought I was the only one who'd vanished. Afterward, people queued to speak to him, to thank him, to ask how he had survived. He said little, just nodded, murmured thank you, sometimes touched their hands. Clara watched from the side, her coat damp, arms folded. This was not her world, but it was his. Again, that evening, they returned to the small guest house the publisher had booked. It was quaint.
Too many floral patterns.
A bed too soft. But Clara didn't complain. Henry sat by the fireplace in the lounge, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand. I saw someone today, he said, eyes on the flames. A man I once taught. He didn't speak to me, just stood in the back and left. Clara sat beside him. Do you regret coming? He shook his head.
No.
But I regret how much I once needed applause. Clara rested her chin on her knees. We all want to be seen.
He looked at her then.
Really looked. And you?
Do you feel seen now?
She hesitated. Sometimes. Henry finished his drink, set the glass down. Then I'm not done yet. The next morning, they boarded the early train home. Neither spoke much. But the silence had changed. It felt more like music now. A resting note. Back in Edinburgh, life resumed, but not as before. The invisible kind was now required reading at the university Henry had once fled. A student society formed around its themes. They invited Clara to speak. She declined politely. Public attention was Henry's territory. She preferred the edges. But something had shifted. People began recognizing her. At the bakery, a young woman whispered, Are you Clara? Then blushed and ran. At the library, someone left a copy of Henry's book on her desk with a note. Thank you for not looking away. Clara didn't know what to do with this new visibility. It made her nervous, restless. And then one Sunday morning, Henry knocked on her bedroom door. When she opened it, he stood there holding a letter. His face unreadable. They want a sequel, he said. Clara blinked. To the invisible kind? He nodded. They want more. My second act. Redemption in hardcover. And I'm not writing it. Clara frowned. Why? Henry's voice was soft. Because I'm not invisible anymore. I'm home. Clara stepped back slowly. You're afraid? Yes. Of what? He looked at her then. The blue in his eyes had faded into something softer, like a morning fog, of what happens when the book is closed, when people forget again, when I'm no longer Henry McCrae the comeback story. Clara didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward and did something she'd never done before. She took his hand, not casually, not as comfort, but as fact. You're not a story, she said. You're a person. You don't need to write anything else to stay. He squeezed her hand gently, and in that moment, something ancient inside him settled. He didn't need to perform anymore. He was no longer surviving. He was loved. Months passed. Edinburgh cycled through its usual wardrobe, gray, grayer, then suddenly gold. The winds turned thoughtful, the cafes quietened. Henry stopped attending readings, stopped answering emails, stopped pretending he still wanted to be found. He had become something rare in the literary world, a man who had tasted relevance and laid it down willingly. Instead, he cooked. He listened to jazz. He walked Clara's cat, Sylvia, on a leash, which confused the entire block. and more, he sat with Clara. On the balcony, by the fireplace, in the narrow kitchen at 11 p.m., sipping tea in silence. But something else was happening. It began with the letters. Dozens. Then hundreds. Handwritten.
Typed.
Some on hotel stationery. Others in crayon. They came from students, widows, veterans, inmates. Some addressed simply to Professor McCrae, care of the woman who found him. They told stories. A man who lost his son to addiction and found solace in Henry's chapter on grief. A girl who read The Invisible Kind in a psychiatric ward and decided not to give up. A retired librarian who said, "Your words gave me back my own." Clara read many of them aloud. One evening, she finished a particularly raw one from a young mother in Belfast and turned to find Henry in tears. Real tears. Quiet. Undeniable. He didn't wipe them. Later, he said, "It's strange, being saved by what you thought had ruined you." Clara replied, "That's what books do. They let us repurpose pain." Autumn gave way to snow. Henry developed a cough. Dry but persistent. He brushed it off, called it a wheeze of age. Clara wasn't convinced. He agreed, grudgingly, to see a doctor. The diagnosis came 3 days later. Quiet. Clinical. Lung cancer. Stage 2. He didn't tell Clara right away. Instead, he returned home, boiled water for tea, and rearranged the books on his shelf. Only that night, when she handed him a bowl of soup and a blanket, did he sit her down. Her face remained still as he spoke. But she didn't finish her soup. "You're not dying," she said after a long silence. Henry raised an eyebrow. "That's not what the scan said." "I don't care," Clara replied, voice steady. "You're not done." He smiled. "Are you writing the sequel for me then?"
No, she said.
"But you are." Treatment began quietly. No one outside the flat knew. Henry insisted. He didn't want sympathy. Clara drove him to appointments in a borrowed car. She sat beside him through the drips and beeps. When his hair began to thin, she trimmed it herself in the kitchen. He didn't flinch. His strength faded, but his sharpness didn't. In fact, the less his body cooperated, the more his mind ignited. He began writing again. Not a memoir. Not fiction. Letters. To strangers. To readers who'd written him. To students who had thanked him. To people who would never expect a reply. Clara posted them daily. She began to receive replies to the replies. A chain of unexpected correspondence. He signed every one. "Yours, Henry McCrae. Still here. Still thankful." One afternoon, she found him asleep on the couch, pen still in hand. A half-written letter to a teenager in Dublin lay on his chest. It read, "I used to think loneliness was the price for honesty. Now I believe it's just the waiting room for grace." Clara sat beside him. She didn't wake him. That night, she wrote her first letter back. To Walter Greaves, Henry's editor. Spring came late that year. On Henry's birthday, Clara organized something he called a suspiciously emotional ambush. She invited no one but Walter, who arrived with a bottle of Talisker, 2 glasses, and a manuscript envelope. The new book. It wasn't a sequel. Not exactly. But it was everything else. Essays, letters, fragments. A chapter Clara had written, and Henry insisted be included. It was titled The Unseen Half of the Story. Walter handed it to Henry with no ceremony. They drank. They argued about semicolons. They laughed too loudly and scared the cat. Henry said it was the best birthday of his life. At midnight, Clara found him standing by the window, looking out at the street below. "What now?" she asked. Henry turned. His voice was quiet. "Now I think about what I leave behind." Clara walked to his side. "You already left it."
No, he said.
"Not the books. You." She blinked. "You're the best thing I've ever published," he whispered. "And I never even wrote you properly." The last summer came quietly. It arrived not with announcement, but with soft light and lavender air. Edinburgh bloomed cautiously, as if the city itself were holding its breath, not wanting to wake the fragile peace inside the flat above the bakery. Henry's health declined gently, like an old man leaving a dinner party, without saying goodbye. No drama. No heroism. Just fewer steps taken, shorter walks, longer silences. Clara adjusted without comment. She arranged pills in little boxes, switched his chair to face the garden, learned how to make bone broth even though she hated the smell. Henry watched her move through these new rituals with a quiet reverence, like someone memorizing a poem for the last time. He never said the word dying, but it hovered. In the pauses between their conversations, in the soft music that filled the flat, in the way Henry began sorting through old notebooks and placing certain pages aside. One morning, he gave Clara a sealed envelope. "For when I'm inconveniently unavailable," he said, smiling thinly. She didn't open it. Instead, she tucked it inside her copy of The Invisible Kind, between the chapter he had titled Clara and the one after it, How to Stay Lost Gracefully. In late June, Henry's final book, The Quiet Return, was released. Unlike his first, it was launched deliberately. Clara insisted on a single event. No cameras. No press. Just people who had written to him. Walter organized it at a small, ivy-covered bookshop tucked into a cobbled lane near George Square. 17 people came. A mother and her son. A nurse from Inverness. A woman who had once tried to end her life and instead ended up starting a garden. They didn't read from the book. They read their own letters. Their stories. Their thank yous. Henry, seated at the center, said only one thing. "Every sentence in this book belongs to you." Then he stood, slowly, and left early, exhausted. Clara remained behind, answering questions, accepting hugs meant for him. Later that night, she found Henry asleep in his chair, a blanket over his legs, Sylvia the cat curled beside him like punctuation. The scene looked complete. But something told her it wasn't the end yet. July was soft. August softer. Clara left the library job for good.
No one was surprised.
She spent her days with Henry, reading to him, walking him when he had strength, listening to stories that wandered more than before but always came back to her somehow. They developed a habit of sitting on the bench, the one by the cathedral, the very one where it had all begun.
Sometimes they spoke.
Other times, they simply existed beside one another, two quiet flames burning down slowly, peacefully. Henry's hand grew colder, his skin thinner, his voice more fragile. But when he looked at Clara, he still lit up like morning. Then, one Sunday evening in September, Henry fell asleep and did not wake. There was no struggle, no theatrics, just stillness. Like the moment after music ends and no one claps, because they're still holding their breath. Clara didn't cry at first. She sat beside him for hours, made him tea out of habit, lit the candle they always lit at 7 p.m., told him a story he wouldn't answer. Then, when the ambulance came and the man gently covered his face, she walked to the window, pressed her forehead to the glass, and wept. She wept until the city blurred and the stars came out. The funeral was small, as he had requested. No speeches, no suits, just a bench beside the cathedral, polished and replanted with daffodils, now bearing a brass plaque. Henry McCrae, every story is a quiet rescue waiting to happen. Clara returned to the flat alone. The books were still there, the chair still angled toward the light. His scent still clung faintly to the old cardigan folded neatly on the armrest. She waited 2 days before opening the envelope he had given her. Inside was a letter, written in his smallest, neatest handwriting. "My dear Clara, if you are reading this, then I've become inconvenient. Apologies. This letter won't be poetic. I used up most of my good sentences on you already. I want to say thank you, but I also want to say don't stop. Don't shrink back into silence. Don't disappear the way I once did. Let the world see you.
Speak. Write.
Be loud when needed. Be quiet when it matters. But never be invisible. This flat is yours. It was never mine, really. Just a stop on my way home. Which, strangely, was always you. Publish what you want of mine. Burn what you don't. You know my voice better than I ever did. I loved you, Clara. Quietly. Completely. And I believe, If love does anything useful, it leaves light behind. Go leave some of your own, yours, Henry. Still here. Still thankful. A year passed. Then, too. Clara didn't leave Edinburgh. She simply moved to a new chapter. She converted the flat into a writing retreat, a space for anyone who needed silence, safety, and books. It filled up quickly. People came from Dublin, Dundee, Dar es Salaam. No one paid more than they could afford. The front door bore a simple wooden sign, "The Invisible House." She taught workshops, spoke at libraries, wrote short essays about grief and noticing and kindness. She never became famous, but she became something better, known. One rainy Tuesday, a young woman handed her a note after a workshop. "You're the reason I applied to uni. You're the first person who made me feel readable." Clara smiled, held the note to her chest. She still visited the bench. She still read Henry's books. But now, when she spoke his name, she did so with laughter instead of longing. One afternoon, she sat at the bench with a journal, watching children chase pigeons. A man passing by paused. He looked at the plaque, then at her. "Did you know him?" Clara closed her book and smiled. "Yes," she said. "He saved my life." The man blinked. "Wasn't he the one who—" "Yes," she nodded. "He wrote a book about being invisible." "And you?" She stood up, stretched, pocketed the journal. "I'm still writing mine." And then she walked away, into the soft gray air, leaving behind a bench, a name, and a silence filled with more meaning than most speeches ever achieve.